Alright, so the goal of this video is to show you how I program sequenced bass synth lines on the Empress ZOIA. Generally I do a verse and a chorus using the 2 foot switches, though if you hold these 2 foot switches for 3 seconds, this light changes to blue and you enter performance mode where you can use 4 different foot switches for 4 different parts if you wanted. For the time being, we are going to stay in regular mode, I guess it's called. So the basics are that you need a sequencer with your bass notes, you need a sound source, which is your oscillator, and a basic synthesizer, which we're doing a subtractive synthesizer, so it's oscillator into a filter into a VCA. And then you need something to trigger that VCA and to trigger those notes in the sequencer. And if you want to do filter stuff, you can trigger that too. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to put an audio output in the top right hand corner. So audio output is in the interface modules, audio output. I always turn on a gain control, and I actually only program things in mono because it's less cables, and you'll see I only have 1 output. I have no inputs at all. This is the rest of my board. That's for guitar only. So let's plop down our audio output. The next thing that I always do is I try to think of it in order. So the first thing I need is something to trigger, or something to do the triggering. So let's choose this block. It's an interface module, and we need a stomp switch. We want the left stomp switch. I generally leave things set to momentary because then you don't have to press it twice, and you can just hold down to keep the envelope triggered. So I'm gonna leave it as momentary, and it's normally 0, otherwise you're sending constant signal. Done. So you'll see that currently it's basically blank. It is orange, and then when I click this, it lights up. And it stays lit as long as I hold down that foot switch. Okay, so next we need our sound source. So we need an oscillator. For the example I showed you earlier, I'm pretty sure I was using a square wave. So let's switch the waveform to a square. Not gonna do any FMN, not gonna do any duty cycle. If you wanna do those things, you can, but this is the ultra simple version. I always switch the oscillator to show me the actual notes that it's playing, and I leave them biased at A0 because then the sequencer will remain consistent with what notes it's sending. So right next to our sound source, we are going to send it to a filter. So I sometimes use the SV filter, I sometimes use the multi-filter. I don't have technical enough knowledge to know what the difference is. Please excuse my turtle moving around. So we'll do a low pass SV filter. So we're going to connect the output of the oscillator, which you see is always putting out audio, to the input of the filter. Turn the frequency of the filter up a little bit. Keep the resonance where it is. You'll see it's sending out some audio. Now, if I connected that directly to the output, it would just start coming out of my speaker right here. We are instead going to put down one more piece, which is the voltage controlled attenuator. I can't remember the word. And we are going to send the output, the output of the filter into the VCA. It's set to nothing, so no sound is coming out. And I will connect my VCA output to my audio output. Now, since the VCA is not being triggered by anything and not being opened by anything, if I move this up, you might hear a very faint, very low note coming out of there. We're going to leave it biased to 0 because we're going to go into control modules, and we're going to have an ADSR that will be controlling the output of the VCA. Now, there's a gate input on the VCA. We will be receiving gate from our left foot switch. So now when I click it, you'll see we can do the attack. We can actually switch the view as well, so you can see the envelope a bit clearer. I usually set the release to a fairly long time so that the notes kind of blend into one another. And I set the attack very low just because I want the notes immediately. Sustain, I usually also turn up. I just need droning bass notes. That's that. So the last thing we need is to send this oscillator some notes. So I'm gonna go to Control Module. I want a sequencer. Let's do 4 steps, for instance. Done. Now we have to assign the steps of this sequencer notes that will be sent to the oscillator. So since this is a bass and I want to not hurt my brain, we're going to start on C and keep them relatively low. We'll go up to E. Let's go down to A and up to F. So this is the gate in. So the gate in is coming from our stomp switch. This is the CV out, which we are going to connect to our oscillator. And you will now see our oscillator is tuned to the first note of the sequencer. So now, when I click this stomp switch, we're gonna have our first bass note. And then when I click it again, we'll have our next one. Let me turn this up a little bit. Next one. And our final one. So that's our first part. So let's say that that's our verse. So I would be playing guitar and just on the 1 of every measure, basically. 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4. So that's the basics of setting up 1. Now I have this switch so that I can have another part. So what I'm actually gonna do is I'm gonna jump to the next page, but before I do that, I'll scroll back, hold the shift button and copy, because you can copy an entire page. I'm gonna place that page, so you copy page 0 before, I'm gonna place it before page 1, hit the save button. So now I have 2 of the exact same thing. All I have to do is I have to switch and edit, shift edit, this stomp switch to not be left, but instead be external. This is just a standard momentary latching switch, and I'm using a regular TR patch cable. I had to go into the settings to switch the C port that it's connected to an open switch. So now, let's switch these notes up. So let's go up to E. Let's say this is an ascending part. So now when I do this one, and that's it. So if I wanted to program these two, once again, all I would do is just copy the page and move it onto another page. There are probably better ways to manage this patch. I'm working on moving all the previous ones that I've designed to a front, all the sequencers will be on a front display page in different colors so that I can tell where each sequence is just in case I lose my place. But overall, it's a relatively simple process, and you're just building ultra basic subtractive synths. You can add effects, you can do all sorts of stuff to make them more interesting sounding, but my goal is just right now to show you how to do this in a very basic format. I hope that makes sense. Feel free to ask questions. I don't really know of a way to make this any simpler, and there are probably smarter ways to patch it, and I'm open to those suggestions, of course. But for now, this does the trick for me, and it keeps my board relatively small and means I don't have to find another human being to play bass for my band. So that's pretty good for me. All right, thanks everybody.